Professor McGinnis, we are so happy to have you with us here today, and we'll ask if you'll just open us up with some comments on the Federal Reserve.
Oh, well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really grateful to have a chance to talk about this important subject, this very important institution that's not only theoretically important, but important in our daily lives. And I'm going to talk for a very short time, so I'm sure, going to oversimplify some matters, but I'm going to try to hit on three topics regarding the Federal Reserve: its functions, its origins and philosophy, and its structure. So the Federal Reserve is a government institution, a federal government institution, as the name suggests, and it has some essential functions in our society. Most importantly, perhaps, it regulates the money supply. And what do I mean by that? Well, very simply, the number of dollars there are intrinsically related to the value of the dollar. If the government, for instance, printed a lot more dollars, the dollar would become less valuable. The Federal Reserve regulates, in some ways, the value of the dollar and the degree of how much money is circulating in the economy. It does that in more sophisticated ways than simply printing more money. There are two important ways it does that. There are others, but here are two of the most important. It regulates it by deciding what the federal funds rate is, and you'll hear about that on the news. It says the Federal Reserve cuts the interest rate. What it means is it cuts the rate that banks have to pay it to themselves borrow from the Federal Reserve. And when it cuts the rate, banks feel themselves freer to lend at lower rates. And so there's more economic activity, more money in the economy. It also buys and sells bonds. The Federal Reserve has a vast quantity of generally government bonds itself. And when it buys bonds from banks, the banks are getting money from the Federal Reserve, and therefore there's more money in the economy. So that's the way, those are the two principal ways it regulates the money supply, and that's a very important function of the Federal Reserve. It also operates as what is called the lender of last resort. And the way I can introduce that subject is to remind you of a famous movie, It's a Wonderful Life. You may remember that It's a Wonderful Life has a famous scene in which there is what is called a bank run. People lose confidence that the bank can pay their depositors. And there's a run on the bank. And you might think that and it often is the case when you have one run on banks, since the banks are interconnected, there'll be other runs on banks. And the banks won't be able to even lend money to themselves to stay afloat. There'll be a crisis of what's called liquidity. Well, the Federal Reserve can step in and be the lender of last resort and lend money to the banks so they can pay their depositors and prevent panics in society, financial panics. And that's a very important role for the Federal Reserve. Because it's so concerned about financial panics, it also tends to regulate banks, make sure that they're not going to be in a position where people are going to doubt their credibility, make sure they have enough cash on hand. And so that regulatory function is an important third function of the Federal Reserve. Now, today, there are some more controversial functions of the Federal Reserve to be involved in making sure that consumers are being treated fairly. And we may want to talk about this, even getting involved in such matters as climate change and other kinds of social regulation matters. So those are some of the essential functions of the Federal Reserve. Well, where are its origins? Well, the origins in 1912, really at the beginning of what is the progressive era. And one of the essential ideas of the Federal Reserve is if the government manages the money supply, it can do a good trade-off between having what we want, high growth, and also full employment. And that's actually in the statute setting up the Federal Reserve, that they have to consciously think as they regulate the money supply of doing so to promote both growth and substantially full employment. And underneath that is even a stronger idea on which the Federal Reserve built that came in, I think, in the 19th century, at least in the United States, that it was the government that was the best guarantor of the value of money. Because prior to that in the United States, we didn't actually have what is called fiat currency, currency given out by the government. We had currency that was private currency. You had different currencies from different banks. And the idea is that the government can best guarantee the currency because it's only ultimately the government that people are going to have the trust in. And that shows us that ultimately the trust in the dollars in our pockets really is not in some material. It's in the whole institution of our US government, our confidence in its laws, and theorists of fiat currency have said the value is not in gold or silver, but in the ordinances and the statutes that set it up. And that brings me to the third. Well, what are the statutes that set up the Federal Reserve? What are the key structures of the Federal Reserve? Well, the Federal Reserve is run not directly by the president or by the Congress, but by a board of governors who are appointed for long terms, 14 years, by the president and can really only be fired in extraordinary circumstances. And for many of the important functions of the Federal Reserve, particularly those related to the money supply, they're joined by governors of the federal regional banks who are not appointed by the president, who are appointed in a complex way where bankers themselves, private bankers, have a large say in who is going to be appointed. And they come together and vote on the question of lowering or raising interest rate. And that's called the Open Market Committee, which is a central function of the Federal Reserve and on which the Board of Governors sit, the 7 members of the Board of Governors, and 5 of the 12 heads of the regional bank, rotating from one place to another, different regions from San Francisco to Atlanta, but always the New York, head of the New York Fed is always on the committee. So that's the basic structure. And one last point I'll make, and I look forward to your question, is note that this is an independent structure. It's independent of the control of the president or of the Congress. And the reason for that is there is a concern that if we had direct political control, presidents or politicians would manipulate the money supply. What they would like to do would be to have great booms right before elections, because that would help them get elected. But that might lead to a hangover after the election. And so we don't want that. We want to have people who are not so directly responsible to the voters, so that we're going to have a more independent expert view that is not going to be subject to the manipulation of politics. Question, how far can you get the Federal Reserve out from politics? That should be an interesting subject of ours. But there's no doubt that there is some empirical literature looking at countries around the world, and some degree of independence for central banks. And there are central banks not only in the United States, but in almost all modern industrialized democracies. Some degree of independence seems to result in better, in what we mean, higher growth, lower inflation than direct control by politicians. And with that, I'd be delighted to talk to you and take your questions.
Okay, Professor McGinnis, that was wonderful. The way this works is I go first, and then we go to Tova, and then we go to Jewel and Jordan, and then we go to Kathy. So I'll start. Okay, my mind is going in 1,000 different directions. I have my primary question, but I'm going to wait on that one and just go back to, I know there were some runs on banks in the late 1800s. I think there were, I mean, you know, I'm not an expert in this area, but because I would have thought that the Federal Reserve might have started after the Great Depression, but it's interesting that it was before the Great Depression, I think is what you just said. And it's interesting. There must have been, I think there were some runs on the banks in the late 1800s or some Depression era. That's probably why they created it in the, I guess, what'd you say, 1912 or something around there. But my question to you is, am I correct in what you said about when it was created? And then what the president, was it Woodrow Wilson? I don't know. But also, hang on, I got to get all my thoughts collected here. It didn't help with the Great Depression. So what happened? That's my first
Well, I
question.
think that's a great question. So there were runs of the bank in the 19th century. Essentially, the dollar as the major currency replaced private currencies before the introduction of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve regularized and put the government in control in a more systematic way. But there were runs on the bank in the 19th century. There's a debate about why that was the case. Some people thought it was because the inherent private banks were always going to be subject to runs and we needed to replace them. Others thought it was actually because of the government regulation of the banks and because the government required these banks to hold, these were generally at the state level, to hold state bonds, which were themselves not always such a good investment. And so those actually caused banks to be insolvent. So there's still an academic debate about the causes of those runs. But you're absolutely right. There's enormous criticism of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve gets up and running in 1912, 1913. And in the Great Depression, it's supposed to, by regulating the money supply, prevent the booms and busts in economy. Well, there's never been a bigger bust in United States history than the Great Depression. So what happened? Well, most economists say the Federal Reserve made enormous mistakes. What it failed to do was act to flood the economy with money. And so what happened was there became a liquidity crisis. People couldn't pay their bills. People went bankrupt. And that led to a spiral, which led to depression. What the bank should have done was should have really cut interest rates, create a lot of money in the system, so that a lot of liquidity, so that people didn't go bankrupt, and so we didn't have the depression. So in general, one way of thinking about what the Fed does now, they're always thinking about how they lost the last war, like generals, right, who lost the last war. So they're always saying, well, whatever happens in a recession, what we can't do is not grease the skids and get the economy working. Now, on the other hand, of course, that may raise questions of will that create inflation down the line? That may be the situation we're in today because, well, we didn't have a depression. We've had two very big signal events to which the Federal Reserve has reacted by cutting interest rates and by buying a lot of bonds and increasing its balance sheet to increase the money supply. One was the Great Recession of 2008. And then, of course, more recently, the pandemic in 2020. And so one question is the inflation we're starting to experience now a hangover from those decisions of the Federal Reserve?
Printing money.
Not printing it directly, but creating more money, yes.
Right. Yeah, that's always confusing to me. It's like they print money, but not really. But that's a whole nother subject. So it's like they're printing money. Well, not exactly. All right. So back to the origins. That's really interesting, is it not? All of us that are watching today that don't know this type of thing, that the Federal Reserve existed before the Great Depression. I didn't know that. Okay. So my next question is, last week we talked about Hamilton's Bank. And it was a bit circuitous for all of us, so a bit confusing. But what's the difference between Hamilton's Bank and the Federal Reserve?
Hamilton's Bank being, of course, formerly called the Bank of the United States, the first bank and then the second Bank of the United States. Well, one could think of the Bank of the United States as something like a proto-Federal Reserve, but it was different in the sense that it existed along with private banks. It had no monopoly in the same way. On the other hand, it intervened to try to stabilize the financial system. And when it was taken out of the system, it led, most economic historians said, at least to some disturbance in the equilibrium and some panics at that time as well. So there were some functions that it had, not the same regulatory functions, but it did act as a bit of a balance wheel with the other private banks, a bit of a lender of last resort, to do some of the same things that the Fed does today. One other point I would make about it in respect to the Fed today, one way of thinking about the Fed, at least I think, is to compare it a bit to the Supreme Court that I spend a lot of time studying. They're both very, and that was true of the Bank of the United States. They're kind of elite institutions that are not completely subject to the democratic will. That was true of the Bank of the United States, precisely because we don't entirely trust democracy to protect the rule of law and to protect the money supply. There's one image that from classical literature that I think is very useful to think about in both terms of both the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve. It says what's called Ulysses and the Sirens. So Ulysses wants to go through and hear the sirens, but he knows that if he hears the sirens, he'll jump off into the ocean and drown. So they tie him to the mast so he can hear the sirens. Well, that's very much the case that you might think that the populace likes a lot of things. They really like the siren call of easy money or let's not follow the rules. There's some good reasons sometimes not to do that. They think there's some good reasons not to do that. And we have the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve that are beyond politics or somewhat constrained from politics to prevent us from jumping into the water and drowning. So another way of thinking about that is a famous line from a Supreme Court justice who says the Supreme Court is to protect Peter sober from Peter drunk. And we get that image, that same image with the Federal Reserve. A famous chair of the Federal Reserve said, it's my job to take away the punch bowl when the party gets going. In other words, when things are really going well in the economy, you've got to raise interest rates and prevent some kind of hangover. So there are real similarities, I think, in these two essential institutions of our democracy that are not themselves, that are somewhat insulated from democratic control.
Interesting. So they're a little more like a republic with a check and balance, I guess.
Yeah, indeed.
As a republic, yeah. So the kind of indirectly, Hamilton's bank, or the first bank of the United States, was more private, whereas the Federal Reserve was something that originated with statute.
More public.
The government.
Actually, the private was actually there were a substantial number of private shareholders in the Bank of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The board of directors have substantial private control. Now today, you might say, well, even private banks have some say in who becomes head of the regional banks, but it's much more public today, and that's in keeping with the change from the 18th century. We have a world that's much more dominated by public institutions than private institutions.
Is it more public because the American people or the investors in the bank are not?
No, it's more public because it's more connected to politics. After all, it's the president who appoints these. My one fear today is, as we have more differences between the Republican and the Democratic parties, there'll be much less of a consensus on who there is to appoint. And we may actually see the same thing happen at the Federal Reserve as we've had in the Supreme Court, really intense battles about who gets on the Federal Reserve because there lacks a consensus across parties. That, I think, is there are 12.
There are 12, and
there's seven members of the Board of Governors. There are 12 regional banks, only 5 of which sit on the Open Market Committee, which is the committee that's most important for the money supply.
12 total.
12 total on the right, and 7 of them appointed by the president, and 5 are the governors. The regional bank presidents.
Interesting. Okay, so 7 are appointed and 5. Interesting. Okay, that's kind of a lopsided number. I can see how that would happen if you've got a Republican or a Democrat that wants all 7 to sway one way or another. They're going to have a little more say over the other 5. Lastly, do I have a last question? Because I have so many questions, but I thought I had one. Okay. Last question. I'm going to toss it to Tova. So we'll do like a minute, get to Tova a little early today. There are lots of people that do not like the Federal Reserve at all. So would you like to address that in like 60 seconds?
Well, the Federal Reserve is a controversial matter. Again, it goes to the heart of the relation of public to private power, and the subject is money. What could get people more excited than that? And those who are critics of the Federal Reserve say correctly that if you look at since the creation of the Federal Reserve, the dollar is worth only 3 cents on the dollar what it was worth back at its creation. Well, how's the Federal Reserve done a good job then? I think what people responding on behalf of the Federal Reserve would say, yes, but that's not the only consideration. Keeping, at least for the public at large, the value of the dollar is not as important as things like economic growth and full employment. And because we've done various things that may have had an effect over time in reducing the value of the dollar, we've smoothed out boom and bust, had higher growth rates than we would otherwise, and had better employment. Now, of course, we don't have an experiment to run it the other way. So it's a counterfactual that people can debate, but that's the reason. There are two reasons, as I say. One is how obviously important this is. And also, we don't have scientific experiments to show that the Federal Reserve is a better way of organizing the structure of the money and money supply than other ways of doing it, including private banking systems.
Okay. Interesting that we didn't have the same currency until what year? I knew in the 1700s we didn't have.
Greenbacks, I believe, I'm no expert on this. Greenbacks, I think, are brought in really at the time of the Civil War, and so Civil War begins the changeover from private banks to a more federally dominated currency system.
Okay, cool. All right, Tova, you're on. Thank you, Professor McGinnis. This is great.
Great, thank you. This is super fascinating. I had to come in just a bit late, so forgive me if I'm, repeating something you already addressed. But something I hear a lot about in the news and that I know affects a lot of, every American is the inflation that has reached very high rates. So how much of this is the Federal Reserve kind of responsible for or able to control? And at the present moment, what are the Federal Reserve's options going forward on how to deal with the inflation crisis?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question of why we have inflation is a question on which economists do not entirely agree. So there are economists called monetarists, of whom Milton Friedman might be the most famous, who would say that inflation is, I think this is a quote, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And therefore, it's really wholly the cause is the Federal Reserve. Because the idea is it wholly depends on how much money there is in the system, how much a dollar is going to be worth. If you have more money, a dollar, and you have a given level of productivity, any individual dollar is going to be worth less. It's sort of just math in some sense. So others think, well, that's only part of it, that other things influence inflation. So two other things that can influence inflation, at least, and you might say at least in the short term, and maybe we would say monetary is more a long-term phenomenon, but at least in the short term, two other things can influence it. One is demand. You put a lot of money in people's pockets and they're all spending it at once, that may also create inflation, because there's just not going to be, there are going to be goods. Everyone's going to want the same goods, and people are going to bid up the price of these goods. And that also could, so that's another. And then there could be a problem. There could be a problem with we could just not be able to create goods. There could be some problem in supply. Say we had some sort of hurricane that destroyed all sorts of factories. Maybe we can't produce enough, and that will increase this problem that there'll be too many dollars chasing too few goods. Well, all of these, I think, we're in a perfect storm at the moment, because I think all of these factors are coming together. So let's begin with the money supply. As I suggested, that to battle the 2008 recession and to battle the pandemic, the Federal Reserve has quite consciously increased the money supply. So those who think that inflation is everywhere a monetary phenomena have a lot to suggest. Well, that's the reason. That's the reason. We were having an overhang of what they've created. It's not only also that the price of goods are going up, it's the asset prices have been going up. You notice the stock market until a few days ago has been really going up. And that also has been caused by that money has been easier. So that's one of the causes, undoubtedly. At least I don't believe there's any doubt that's one of the causes. Another cause is on the demand side. Larry Summers, a professor at Harvard, the former Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration, warned the Biden administration that its very large stimulus package, on the heels of a lot of other stimulus packages, was going to put so much money in people's pockets, it was going to also increase inflation. And he's now going around, of course, saying, well, I told you so. While being a Democrat, he said, that was a big policy mistake, and is that the cause of this kind of inflation. And then finally, because of the pandemic, we have some supply issues. There are enough workers in some areas to produce these goods. So we also have what are called supply bottlenecks. And notice that's what the president wants to emphasize, because in some sense, he can't do anything about the Federal Reserve, and he doesn't want to admit any mistake in policy on his own part. And so also this kind of blames it on the private enterprises. So those are all, I think, three, in my view, and I'm not an economist, but looking at it from the outside, inflation, at least in the short term, is a multi-factored phenomenon. Even if in long term, it may be mostly a monetary phenomenon. And at the moment, we have a perfect storm of those factors. So I'm not optimistic that inflation is going to disappear anytime soon.
Well, thank you. Wow, definitely puts a lot of perspective and context on just the headlines I hear. So thank you very much. And then I'm curious, as our idea of money has kind of changed a lot since the Federal Reserve was created with, online cryptocurrencies or, everything being online and credit cards and everything, how has the Federal Reserve had to adjust its operations, or have they?
Well, they have. So I think you asked two questions. There are two elements to your question. One are simply credit cards. And so one is just a measure of actually the money out there. Again, I'm not an economist, but there are different measures of the money supply called M1, M2. Some are very simple, the dollars out there. But as you actually accurately point out, there are a lot of non-physical dollars that are part of the money supply. Don't they have to be included? And the Federal Reserve does include those as well. So that's quite straight. It's not straightforward, but it's just an expansion of what we understand of the electronic money in the form of dollars. It's just other kinds of dollars. And we have to take account of that to understand the extent of the money supply. And the Federal Reserve has measures for that are different from just the number of dollars. And you're absolutely right. Those are the larger measure is the one that's more important. Precisely, we're using fewer and fewer physical dollars compared to electronic dollars. Your next question about cryptocurrencies, though, is a much more substantial challenge to the Federal Reserve, because something like Bitcoin, which many of you have heard about, one of the facts about it is that it's not a dollar. It is private money. And it is private money of which there is, because of an algorithm, only going to be a certain amount created. And so those who created Bitcoin consciously created it as an alternative to the dollar. And the question is, could at some point cryptocurrency become more attractive than the dollar? At the moment, it is not as a currency. It's really not a currency because it's so volatile. But at some point, could it become more stable and therefore become a better store of value than the dollar? Because the dollar and any currency created by a government has an Achilles heel in this sense. What are you concerned about as an individual from your currency? You just like it to keep its value or increase in value. You as an individual aren't concerned about economic growth or whether other people are employed. And so that means that insofar, notice my defense of the Federal Reserve was it lowered, the value of the dollar may have declined, but it did other good things for society. That might not speak very much to you as an individual who, okay, you did great things for society, but but the value of the dollar in my pocket declined. The challenge of cryptocurrency is, well, maybe that's going to be an alternative. It's just going to be focused on keeping the value up. At least it theoretically could do that. And if that's true, it's a fundamental challenge to the Federal Reserve in the way that a credit card is not.
Wow, fascinating. I mean, I never really thought of it that way. So thank you. And then I know this is a broad question, but kind of can you give us a sense of what the equivalent of a Federal Reserve is in other countries and how that might broadly differ from America's system or not?
Well, so almost every, as I suggest, every industrialized country has something that looks like the Federal Reserve. In fact, the Bank of England was, the Hamilton was consciously thinking of the Bank of England when he created the Bank of the United States. And so the Bank of England has been around a very long time and performed some of the same functions as the Federal Reserve. Indeed, some people think the Bank of England it's not that the Waterloo was won as Wellington settled on the playing fields of Eton. It was won because they had the Bank of England. What the Bank of England did was allowed the British government to borrow money at a lower cost than France or its continental counterparts. And that allowed, because it was able to borrow money, it allowed in crises like wars for it to put forward a lot more material force than it. So banking is very connected in that way, central banking to national security. So there are all of these, and they look a bit like the Federal Reserve in the sense that they are generally insulated from direct popular control. The euro is the other most important currency now, and that's a currency created by the European Union, and that's in some sense a real innovation, because note that's a currency that's not of one particular country, but of a group of countries. And that was created because the idea was that if you have a common currency, that's a big advantage. And this I may have suggested as another advantage, maybe of the Federal Reserve over private currencies. One doesn't have to calculate, well, how much is, before the euro, how much is a franc worth in terms of a Deutschmark, of German's currency, because if you had to hold all these currencies, that was costly for businesses. You had to think about, well, what is this currency going to be worth a week from now? Creating a single currency for countries that traded a lot with one another, like the European countries, was another reason to create a currency. And to create a currency, you'd had to have a central bank to manage that money supply. So that's, I think, the biggest innovation actually was to create a currency that has transcendent national borders, but is still controlled by a consortium of governments. Now, we could talk, and I won't go into it, that the euro has faced a few issues with that because some of the governments have been imprudent, and there was a euro crisis, you may remember. Maybe you don't remember, I do remember, of around 10 or so years ago. But though there are a lot of other central banks, indeed they meet and talk a lot together to try to coordinate their money supplies. That's a big function now of the Federal Reserve, is to be a coordinator with the many other central banks that exist in the world today.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll pass on to the next person. That was great, though. Thank you.
Hello, this is another fun conversation. Can you hear us?
Yes.
All right, this is another fun conversation for us. I enjoy the economic turn that our constitutional chats have taken. So the Federal Reserve, first question, and I know that we have a short amount of time, but in the Federal Reserve versus the first central bank of Alexander Hamilton, can you tell us the difference in the powers of the two?
Oh, well, the powers of the Federal Reserve are much greater. They have many more the I think one of the biggest differences, the Bank of the United States had very few regulatory powers over other banks. The Federal Reserve really regulates other banks as well. And so it is a regulator in a way that the Bank of the United States, First Bank of the United States, at least was not a direct regulator. It may have had some powers that forced other banks to pay a lot of attention to it, but that was a big difference. It also did not have a monopoly, essentially, on the money supply. There were private banks at the time and so other kinds of currencies that were used. So that was another important difference between them. And finally, it didn't have the same goals as the Federal Reserve. It wasn't focused on things like creating full employment in the United States. It didn't have these what we call kind of progressive era goals of that the United States now has for its central bank.
Thank you.
So those are three
Definitely
important differences. I'm sure there are
very
others.
big. Yeah, they're very big differences. So I'm struggling with is we talked a little bit about the debate between Jefferson and Hamilton for the original bank, but I see such a growth of powers between and change in the powers and structure between the U.S. central bank and the Federal Reserve. And I'm trying to find I know it was during a progressive era of movement in the government, but where is this in the Constitution? How much scrutiny has it come under? And it's at its point, like in its among its contemporaries and through to today. Where is the justification constitutionally for the Federal Reserve and its powers?
Well, today, so there are two possible questions about the Federal Reserve. One, I think, is relatively well settled, even if it wasn't settled in, at the beginning of the Constitution. It's that the federal government can regulate anything that's economic because it has a substantial interstate effect. Now, whether that's correct is open to question, I think, but it's not going to be changed. It really is the foundation, not only of the Federal Reserve, but of all the multiple alphabet agencies we see in Washington, to even someone who is as doubtful about the extent of what's called the commerce power under the Constitution given to Congress, is as Judge Bork was, said to overrule it today would be to create chaos. So I don't think the Federal Reserve is going to be seriously challenged in that respect. Another kind of challenge to the Federal Reserve is I talked about the independence, the idea that its Board of Governors really can't be fired by the president. That's in some tension with another idea, which is that the president is in control of the executive branch. And the Supreme Court has been moving to give the president more control of the executive branch. And I think that could be a more open to challenge.
So question right there. How does the Federal Reserve come more under the executive branch if the Congress was granted the power to control the value of currency?
Well, that's an excellent question. It comes under control of what is called a delegation to the executive branch. In most of our modern government is administrative government, in which the Congress doesn't legislate directly, but delegates its power to the executive branch to regulate. Or some constitutional stickler says, well, it doesn't really delegate its power, it just gives it issues its rules and lets the executive branch fill in the details of those rules. But there are some mighty big details the executive fills in. And essentially, one way of thinking of the Federal Reserve, it's part of a much larger fact about the modern state, is that modern government is modern administrative government. And the Federal Reserve is the most important regulatory administrative agency. And it is an example of an independent agency, independent in the sense that it's not directly accountable to the president. And there are good reasons for it.
Yeah,
and there are those who think that the president should be in control. That's part of what it is to be granted the executive power of the United States, which is what Article 2 of the Constitution begins with.
Certainly. It's certainly something so big at this point that it would be chaos to change, but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because we can't change it means that it is true or right. The debate with it, if you're trying to read, I mean, we talked on the show a long time ago about different perspectives, an originalist perspective and different perspectives of reading the Constitution. And under many perspectives, it is pretty hard to find any of the powers if you think about something like the Federal Reserve's decision to allow, I think it was Lehman Brothers to fail, or their decision to not allow others to fail. These powers, which directly change Americans' lives in a very top-down way over what is meant to be private industry, it's pretty big. So possibly we're talking about not changing the foundation of our monetary policy, but in still modifying or limiting. There's a arm or an agency, I can't remember what it's called, in the Federal Reserve, which is the arm that necessarily more so regulates, which a committee possibly. I remember reading about it. We'll say like this arm of the Federal Reserve said this, and it will affect something in the money markets. Do banks literally borrow from the Federal Reserve? Do private banks borrow from the Federal Reserve and then they lend that money to, who banks lend to? Is that how the system works?
Well, the banks certainly do borrow from the Federal Reserve, certainly as a matter of last resort. And as you say, one of the things is that they didn't lend to Lehman. That's why Lehman went bankrupt. And so they have a lot of power to do this. So let me just say something I think is implicit in your question. One other thing I actually do is I write about originalist theory. So it doesn't, I think, follow, because even if something is wrong as an original matter, that the court should change things, because there's also in constitutional law, and I think even contemplated at the time of the founding of the United States, an idea of what is called precedent. And no, the world is such that sometimes we make mistakes, and to uproot those mistakes would be more costly than to let them continue. We could think of those, people's lives, right? It may have been a mistake to do something, but it doesn't follow that they should get rid of everything that was connected to that mistake. That would be really disruptive. So we have an idea of reliance interest, that society and individuals rely on past decisions, even if they're mistaken. Where we draw that line is, I think, a very difficult one. And I think now that we have a more originalist court, I think the one huge question is how the originalists on the court are going to reconcile that with precedent. But the idea that they're going to say that the Open Market Committee is beyond the power of the Commerce Clause, that's the committee you're talking about, is, I think, would be a mistake, and I don't think is likely on the horizon, because there's so much reliance of our society tied into that. What I think is a little less clear is we could imagine a Federal Reserve, I think, that where the president had greater control. And one interesting question would it operate that differently? Because there are non-legal restraints on the president. If the president just started firing the heads of the Federal Reserve, bad things would happen in the economy, and that would look pretty bad for him. The bond market and the stock market are themselves constraints on the president in an advanced society, and that's a good thing in my view. We don't want to have too much power in any one individual.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
I have a question about their use of powers, I guess you would say. So if the Federal Reserve was given the power to control the value of currency, why does that mean that they could leave the gold standard?
Well, it wasn't as I understand it, and again, I'm not an expert on this, as I understand it, that was actually a decision of the President of the United States to leave the gold standard, President Nixon to leave the gold
Okay.
standard. So it's not a decision of the Federal Reserve to leave the gold standard. And I don't think they had the authority at that time. I just don't remember exactly the statutory structure at that time, but it was a decision of President Nixon.
Okay. And what that kind of leads me into talking about inflation and I was always so baffled that, once you left this standard, once you left having the physical money that could back up your dollar, I have a dollar in my room. It says this dollar is backed by silver in the Federal Reserve. Once that stopped, it allowed for so much inflation. And as you said earlier, our dollar is 3 cents to the dollar. That's what you said, right?
From what it was at the beginning of the Federal Reserve, yes.
Yeah. So we're 3 cents to the dollar. And yet so many economists will say we're still better off. Everything is still better for the American. But in actuality, we still do have, it's kind of inarguable that we don't have less money. We have more dollars, but less value per dollar.
We have less value per dollar, but we're still much richer than they were in 1912. I don't know what multiple times wealthier than we are in terms of real purchasing power than we had then. So I think what would be the claim would be that what the Federal Reserve does by allowing enough money to both smooth out booms and busts and to make sure there's enough money to allow people to produce more and more, it's actually made us richer over time, despite the fact that nominally the value of the dollar is less. And despite the fact that, that we're overall better off. Now, that doesn't mean that some people aren't made worse off. People on fixed incomes, of course, that's not so good when there's inflation, and that's as generally the case with economics. Even if everyone is better off, the whole society as a whole is better off. That doesn't mean individuals aren't made worse off by inflation, and that's a real serious issue, I think, for the Federal Reserve. Its decisions sometimes will crush a whole group of people in society, savers, for instance, when you have high inflation. And the idea of an economist would just say, well, we're all better off, so we could compensate those people. Well, but we're not going to compensate those people. Now, we try to do it in some ways through inflation adjusting Social Security, but there are many people for whom that obviously isn't a sufficient adjustment. They have other assets, they have other things they're depending on that may be really affected by inflation. And also, you might think more generally, the Federal Reserve, by creating a more complicated system, means that the people who are going to do well are people really very sharp people who understand and follow the Federal Reserve and figure out where to put their money and their assets at the expense of people who are less financially attuned or financially cognitive. So that's another problem, which I think is also, just as I've suggested, the Federal Reserve is part of the rise of the administrative state. One other problem with the administrative state is it creates a world of complex rules, and complex rules have differential effects on people depending on their level of education and ability.
All right, thank you. I think it's time for some audience questions now. So I'll pass it over to Kath.
Well, thank you, Professor McGinnis. And we've got a lot of audience questions and comments today. And I wanted to read a couple of comments from John Chambers, who says that to overrule the Federal Reserve would definitely create chaos in the administrative state, but not necessarily to the people, which I thought was an interesting comment. And so John suggests it be changed over time, step by step, just the way it was built up. He says that's how it is to be taken apart. And then Barbie Mooring says, great point. Just because it is and hard to overturn doesn't mean it's constitutional. And that we've had a lot of our listeners questioning the constitutionality today of the Federal Reserve. But Jay McConville asks, there are often calls to audit the Fed. What is that people want to audit and why? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am familiar with that. I think it's more of a slogan, frankly. I mean, the audit the Fed is, figure out where the money's going. I think it really is a reflection of dissatisfaction with the Fed more than a practical program for changing it. I think the questions though are absolutely right. I was speaking to the question of whether the Supreme Court is likely to get rid of the Fed by saying it's unconstitutional. It's certainly in people's power to reform the Fed little by little, organically. That is absolutely a plausible idea, and I think it's quite open. I'm quite someone who's not at all persuaded necessarily. I think it's very difficult issue that the Fed has been on balance a good thing as opposed to private currencies, for instance, and so I think it's perfectly plausible to make those kinds of arguments that little by little we should allow more competition with currencies, and that will improve our situation. That I think will be a much more sensible movement than simply the kind of slogan audit the Fed, which I just don't think is going to really do much.
Okay. Joe Dunnigan says, what do you think are the implications of the creation of central bank digital coins and private sector alternative stable coins like the US dollar currency issued by Circle? Will these developments make the payment system more stable and also give greater access to the payment system for the public in general?
Well, I could give a whole talk on this. Let me just talk briefly about the central bank currency. I think that concerns me a lot. Because if the central bank gets rid of dollars and we only have digital dollars at the consumer end, that would be a huge loss of privacy of citizens, because digital dollars can be, if they're created by the federal government, that's a very different kind of cryptocurrency than a private cryptocurrency, can be followed. Moreover, it allows, and some people think this is a benefit, I see it as a danger. One problem that sometimes thought to be a problem is the Federal Reserve can't have negative interest rates. In other words, it cannot make the dollar that you have in your pocket less valuable because it's earning negative. It'll be 99 cents next year. But if it had a digital currency, because the dollar in your pocket could be under your mattress or in some bank that the government doesn't control. But if it had a digital currency, the government could just program the dollar to be less valuable. So I think a digital consumer currency would give the government an enormous amount more power, both with respect to our privacy and with respect to a great deal of more control over the money supply, things that I think people would find very disquieting, that they actually could reduce the value of the money that you had.
Okay, thank you. And then speaking of reforms for the Fed, Professor James Klinger says, many who advocate the unitary executive theory of the presidency have criticized the inability of the president to remove members of independent commissions. But I've never heard anyone say that presidents should be able to remove Federal Reserve governors, let alone presidents of the Federal Reserve banks. Does anyone make that argument?
Yes, indeed, that argument has been made in the Supreme Court. The government, not surprisingly, said it was not well founded. They have made those arguments. At the moment, those arguments are not well supported because the independent agencies are there's some case law that favors them. The court, however, has been cutting back on that in the last few years, and so I think it might be a much more live issue whether the Federal Reserve is consistent with the unitary executive. I do think that's an issue to watch.
Well, thank you. And I guess finally, we only have about a minute left, but I I had to get off briefly because of a connection issue. So I don't know if we touched on this yet, but one of our listeners writes that the Federal Reserve is about to meet here, I believe in Washington in the next day or two. And they're going to be looking at possibly raising interest rates in order to deal with inflation. What do you think is most likely to happen at this next Federal Reserve meeting?
Well, I have no inside information, but given that the market has been in free fall the last few days, I think the prediction of the market is they're going to be raising interest rates, because in general, when the interest rate goes up, the market faces some headwinds. There's a famous slogan for investors: "Don't fight the Fed." And I think the market is predicting we better not fight, but surrender.
Well, Janine, I'll turn it back over to you.
Oh, those were like, this has been just the most amazing, fascinating show. And Professor McGinnis, you've just been awesome. And I thought all the questions have been great. And our listener questions are really terrific too. I just have to throw out a really perhaps naive and stupid question. I'm going to go for it. Central bank. What's the central bank? Y'all were just talking about the central bank.
Well, the central bank is essentially the bank, the center of the monetary system. All the other banks are in some ways ultimately dependent on it. They're now regulated by it. The central bank lends the money, determines the interest rate at which they'll get money. So it's at the center of things. It's a good name for it. It's at the center of our monetary system.
Is the central bank the Federal Reserve?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
The Federal Reserve is a central bank. There are other central banks, the Bank of England, but it is a central bank.
So the Federal Reserve and the central bank are the same thing?
Yes.
No wonder
it's the American central bank, correct.
Okay, I get it now. I was like, wait, central bank? Okay, so but is the Federal Reserve sometimes called the central bank?
Yes, it would be called a central bank, right? There's a whole kind of, as I said, there's a whole group of central banks. Bank of England, now the Euro Bank, all of them are central banks.
But in America, our central bank would be the Federal Reserve, just here in America. Okay, and lastly, to wrap this in 30 seconds, the appointed 12, well, 7 are appointed, 5 are from governors of the banks. They cannot be, we were just having this discussion, so I just want to clarify it. They can't be removed?
The 7 Federal Reserve governors can only be removed for extraordinary bad behavior. So they can't easily be removed. The bank governors can only be removed by their board of directors, who are not subject to presidential control. So they look.
And that's your correlation. That's your correlation to the Supreme Court, that the 7 are appointed for life, essentially.
No, they're not appointed. They're appointed for 14 years, and they don't have life. They don't even have complete tenure for that. But it's very hard to fire them. I don't believe anyone has ever been fired from the Federal Reserve.
Do people have any stayed on after 14 years, like different terms in the Senate and the House?
Actually, and this is a whole nother discussion, they rarely stay on for 14 years. And that's because they don't have to stay on. The outside options, going to Goldman Sachs or another bank that pays you $1 million or $2 million, are very good. It's not like being the head of some maritime commission. You've got very good outside options once you've been on the Federal Reserve. So
the people that
stay 14 years.
Yeah, they want to go make some money, and it's a service more than anything. So the people that want to remove these governing 12 in one way or another, they want to remove them within the 14-year span.
Well, if you got rid of the removal restrictions, you could remove them. That's right.
But that's what people are saying. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe people don't. I wonder if a lot of Americans probably don't understand that they're only there for 14 years to begin with.
Oh, they may not. I mean, obviously, I think that what Americans understand about the Federal Reserve is probably, not surprising. They have better things to do with their time than to study the Federal Reserve.
Like what they know about the Federal Reserve is nil, like me.
Not the details, at least.
Most Americans probably know a lot more about the Federal Reserve than I have known. I have known nothing about the Federal Reserve, which is why I think it's so exciting to have a series like this. But Professor McGinnis, wow, you just talked incessantly. We've worn you out, I'm afraid, but
Well,
you've
thank
just been
you.
brilliant.
Don't mind it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And appreciate all of our listeners. And Kathy, Julian, Jordan, Tova, Aubrey. And Kathy, you want to tell us about the next show? We still have our economy series next week.
Yes, we have our economy series next week, and we will be looking at the stock market next week. So we invite
It may
every,
be a good week to do it.
definitely, definitely.
Okay,
So-
Julian, Jordan, you want to sign off?
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank
Awesome
you.
show.
Have a nice rest of your day.
Aubrey?
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Professor McGinnis. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone, for watching. What a great series.